My father promised me that warehouse.
Then why isn't it in the will?
You know he said it. You were there.
Father changed his mind.
No, somebody changed his will. Careful, Grace. Everything your father owned now belongs to Douglas. So after nursing him every night, this is how you repay me?
The lawyer has finished reading the will.
No.
The betrayal has only just begun.
Mommy, don't cry.
I'm here. I know, baby. I know.
Grace Okoro had learnt, over 29 years, exactly how her father breathed when he was trying to not cry. A held pause at the top of the breath, a slow release through the nose like he was letting something heavy settle back down inside his chest where no one could see it. She was doing that same thing now, standing at the edge of his open grave, and she hated that it was the last thing he had ever taught her. The morning of the burial, before the compound filled with mourners, before the caterers arrived with their folding tables, and the tent men argued over where the canopy poles should go, Grace had knelt beside the casket in the empty parlor and pressed her palm flat against the polished wood. She did not pray, she did not cry, not yet. She simply stayed there, the way she used to sit beside his hospital bed at 2 in the morning, matching her breathing to the rise and fall of the machines, as if her stillness alone could keep him tethered to the world. "You said you'd fix it," she whispered. "You said before everything got hard to say that you would fix it. I believed you, Papa. I always believed you." Her 4-year-old daughter, Faith, found her there a few minutes later, small bare feet slapping against the tiled floor, a wilted hibiscus flower clutched in one fist because she had heard someone say flowers were for the dead and wanted to bring one herself. "Is Grandpa sleeping now?" Faith asked, climbing up to press her forehead against the casket the way she used to press it against her grandfather's knee when she wanted a story. Grace did not have an answer that wouldn't break her, so she simply lifted her daughter into her arms and held her so tightly that Faith squirmed. "Mommy, you're squeezing," the little girl said. "I know, baby. I'm sorry." Grace loosened her grip but did not let go. She buried her face in her daughter's hair, in the smell of the shea butter she used every morning, and let herself have exactly 4 seconds of falling apart before she straightened her spine the way her father had taught her. A woman who bends never rises again.
Chief Emmanuel was a good man. May God comfort your family.
Thank you. Does anyone want to know how I'm doing? Papa isn't even buried.
And?
You're already thinking about the inheritance.
Some people prepare for tomorrow.
The burial is over.
Then why does it feel like we're only just beginning?
Because now, we read the will.
By the time the courtyard filled with mourners, 300 of them, dressed in the required white and black, fanning themselves with programs bearing Chief Emmanuel Okoro's smiling photograph, Grace had rebuilt the wall around herself brick by brick. She stood at the front with Faith's hand in hers, greeting people she barely remembered, accepting condolences that all began to sound the same after the 40th repetition. He was a good man. May his soul rest. God will comfort you. She wanted, more than anything, for one person, just one, to ask her how she actually was. Not how the family was, not how the business would carry on, how she was. The daughter who had sat up every night for 6 weeks, changing her father's drip and reading him the business pages because he refused to admit he could no longer hold the newspaper steady himself. No one asked. Her brother, Douglas, moved through the crowd like a man already measuring his inheritance in the width of people's bows to him. He had always known how to wear grief the way other men wore a good suit, cut to fit, worn with confidence, taken off the moment the occasion required something else. Beside him, his wife Patricia dabbed at dry eyes with a lace handkerchief so pristine it might have come from the shop that morning. Grace's stepmother, Beatrice, sat in the front row of chairs beneath the canopy, spine straight, hands folded, her black dress cut from fabric that cost more than 3 months of what Grace would soon be earning without knowing it yet. Beatrice's grief looked to anyone who didn't know her like dignity. To Grace, who had watched her for 11 years, it looked like waiting. It was after the burial, after the last handful of soil had been thrown, after the drummers had finished their mournful send-off song, after the crowd had thinned to the tight circle of family gathered in the parlor with cups of tea no one drank, that the real funeral began. Mr. Adeyemi, the family lawyer, was a thin man with a habit of adjusting his glasses before delivering anything difficult, as if the gesture might soften what came next. He opened a leather folder on the low table and cleared his throat twice. Chief Okoro left clear and specific instructions, he said. The company, Okoro Textiles, along with the family compound at Mercy Street and all associated properties and holdings are to be transferred in full to his son, Douglas Okoro. Grace felt the words land somewhere behind her ribs, a dull, physical blow, but she made herself sit perfectly still. She had expected this part. Douglas was the son. The business was always going to be his to run, at least on paper, at least in name. What she had not expected, what made the air go thin in her lungs, was what came next. To his daughter, Grace Okoro, Mr. Adeyemi continued, not lifting his eyes from the page. He leaves his personal library and a sum of 200,000 naira. For a moment, nobody spoke. Even Douglas seemed to register the strangeness of it, glancing sideways at Beatrice before rearranging his face into something neutral. Grace felt Faith's small fingers tighten around her thumb, the child sensing, the way children do, that something had gone terribly wrong in a room full of adults pretending everything was fine. "That is not right," Grace said. Her voice came out quieter than she meant it to, almost apologetic, as if she was the one who needed to be forgiven for speaking. "Papa promised me the Eastern warehouse. Before he got sick, before any of this, he sat me down in his study and told me it would be mine. He said the words to my face, Douglas. You were in the house that evening. You must remember." Douglas did not look at her. He studied the rim of his teacup as though it required his full attention. "Father's will is father's will, Grace. Whatever he said to you in a private conversation is not the same as what he put his signature to. You should respect his final wishes, not argue with them in front of everyone." "This is not respect," Grace said, and now something in her chest had cracked open, letting heat rush in where the numbness had been. "This is theft, and you know it." Beatrice rose from her chair, unhurried, smoothing the front of her dress with the calm of a woman who had rehearsed this exact moment many times in the privacy of her own mirror. "Grace, your father made his decision while he still had his mind and his strength. A man's word before he sits down with a lawyer is not the same as what he signs after. This will was drawn up properly and it is final."
You changed it, Grace said, and she was standing now, though she could not remember rising. While he was sick, while I was the one sitting up with him every night, bringing down his fever with wet cloths, because you couldn't stand to be in the same room as illness, you were somewhere with lawyers, making sure none of it would ever reach me. Careful, Douglas said, stepping between them with the practiced ease of a man used to managing his wife's temper, and now apparently his sister's grief. Do not disgrace our father's memory with accusations you cannot prove, Grace. Not today. Grace looked around the room. At Patricia, suddenly fascinated by a loose thread on her sleeve, at the family friends near the doorway, pretending to be absorbed in quiet conversation while missing nothing. At Mr. Ademi, who would not lift his eyes from the folder in his lap, at her father's portrait on the wall above them, still smiling the smile he had given her the day she graduated secondary school, the day she brought Faith home from the hospital, the evening he had promised her a warehouse he apparently never protected. She understood, with a coldness that settled into her like the first chill of Harmattan, that she was entirely alone in this room. Keep the company, she said quietly, lifting Faith on her hip. Keep the house. Keep every last thing in it. But do not you dare call me your sister again, not after today. She walked out, through the parlor, past the folding chairs still arranged for mourners, past the wilting wreaths with her father's name spelt out in white chrysanthemums, past the family driver who suddenly found something urgent to examine on the ground, rather than meet her eyes. Faith's small arms wrapped around her neck, silent, sensing that this was not a moment for questions. By the time Grace reached the gate, the sky had gone the deep grey it had threatened all morning, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, not gently, but hard, the way the sky sometimes weeps when it has held itself together for too long. She did not have an umbrella. She did not go back for one. She simply walked, her daughter's face pressed into the curve of her neck, and let the rain do what she would not allow herself to do in front of anyone who had come to watch her father buried and her future decided in the same afternoon. Only when they were 2 streets away, soaked through, did Grace finally let the sound escape her. Not loud, not dramatic, just a single broken sob that she quickly swallowed when she felt Faith stare against her. "Mommy?" Faith lifted her head, rain running down her small face, and reached up to touch her mother's cheek with a wet thumb, wiping at tears that the rain had already disguised. "Don't cry. I'm here." It was such a small thing, a 4-year-old parroting words she must have heard some adult say to her once, but it undid Grace completely. She sat down right there on a stranger's low garden wall in the rain and pulled her daughter into her lap and let herself weep the way she had not permitted herself to weep once in 6 weeks of nursing a dying man, 1 afternoon of burying him, and 1 hour of watching her whole inheritance disappear into someone else's hands. "I'm going to fix this," she whispered into her daughter's wet hair, not entirely sure yet whom she was making the promise to, her daughter, her father, or the frightened, furious woman she had just become. "I'm going to fix this, baby. I promise you, I'm going to fix this." She did not yet know how impossible that promise would feel in the weeks to come, or how many times she would lie awake wondering if she had broken it the moment she made it.
Mommy, are we poor now?
We have less money than before.
Then why we go back to Grandpa's house?
Because some people took what belonged to us, but they can never take who we are.
Okay, Mommy.
Don't worry, it's going to be fine.
Okay, Mommy.
The room above Mama Blessing's provision store was 9 steps long and 6 steps wide. Grace had counted the first week in the particular way grief makes a person catalogue the smallest details of a life gone suddenly unfamiliar. One window, its shutter warped so it never closed all the way. A single mattress on the floor, a gas burner in the corner that she had already scolded Faith about twice, though the child had never once tried to touch it, only watched it with the wide, careful eyes of someone who understood without being told that they were in somewhere fragile now. The humiliations arrived in small, precise doses, the way Grace imagined a slow poison might work. The landlord, a heavy-set man named Mr. Bassi, who came every Friday afternoon, a full day before rent was due, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed until she produced the money, never quite looking at her the way he looked at his other tenants, with a faint, unspoken, "I know who your family is, and I know they let this happen to you." The market women, who had once called her our own chief's daughter with pride when she walked past on her father's arm, now lowered their voices just enough to be heard. That's the Okoro girl. Imagine sleeping above Blessing's shop like a stranger in her own city. Worst of all was the silence. Cousins who had once flooded her phone with messages during her father's illness, prayers, scripture verses, promises to visit, had gone quiet within a fortnight of the funeral, as though grief itself were contagious and poverty more so. She understood, in the cruelest possible way, exactly how much of her old life had been built not on love, but on proximity to money. Faith did not complain, not once, and that was somehow harder to bear than complaints would have been. She simply adjusted, folding her small dresses into a neat pile at the foot of the mattress each night, learning to fall asleep to the sound of Mama Blessing's shop shutters rattling closed downstairs, learning not to ask why they no longer visited the big house with the swimming pool that Douglas's children still swam in every weekend. It was on the 9th night, when Grace thought her daughter was already asleep, that Faith spoke into the darkness. "Mommy, are we poor now?" Grace lay still for a long moment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had slowly begun to look, in her exhaustion, like the shape of a bird taking flight. "We have less money than before," she said carefully, "but we are not poor, baby. We have each other, and we have Mommy's 2 good hands, and that is worth more than any house." Grandpa's house was nice, Faith said, in the simple, devastating honesty of a 4-year-old. "I liked the garden." "I know you did. Can we go back?"
Grace closed her eyes. "Not that house, no. But I am going to build you an even better garden one day. One with your name on the gate. Do you believe me?" There was a long pause in the dark, long enough that Grace feared she had said too much, promised too much, set her daughter up for another disappointment in a life that had already handed her too many for someone so young. "I believe you," Faith finally whispered, and reached out a small hand until she found her mother's in the dark, lacing their fingers together the way she had done since she could first grip anything at all. "You always keep your promises, except the ice cream one. You forgot that one." Despite everything, Grace laughed. A real laugh, cracked and rusty from disuse, but real. "You are right. I did forget the ice cream. We'll fix that one first. The garden might take longer." She lay awake long after Faith's breathing had evened into sleep, turning her daughter's small, unshakable faith over in her mind like a stone she could not put down. "You always keep your promises." She had never felt less certain of anything in her life, but she understood, lying there in the dark above a stranger's shop, that she could not be the reason her daughter's faith broke. Whatever else the world took from her, she would not let it take that.
The next morning, she began the search that would take her through 11 closed doors before the 12th opened. Most of the shop owners in the fabric district recognized her name the moment she gave it, and their faces did one of two things: either soften into a pity she found nearly unbearable, or hardened into a suspicion she understood even less. Why is Chief Okoro's daughter looking for work sweeping floors? What happened to bring her this low? Is there a scandal here we should stay away from? By the 8th closed door, Grace had stopped introducing herself by her father's name at all. By the 11th, she had nearly believed anyone would say yes. Adaeze Fashions was a modest shop wedged between a shoe repairer and a phone credit vendor. Its signboard faded, but its window displayed genuinely lovely. A deep blue ashwabi gown with hand-beaded sleeves that made Grace stop walking before she had even decided to go in. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 50, broad-shouldered, flour-dusted at the wrist from handling starch, and a face that had clearly weathered more storms than it advertised. She looked Grace over once, head to foot, with a swift assessing gaze of someone used to sizing up both fabric and people in a single glance. "I don't need a manager," the woman said, before Grace had said one word about what she was there for. "Whatever you've come asking for, the answer is no if it involves sitting behind a desk giving instructions. I need someone who isn't afraid to bleed a little threading a needle." "I can do anything," Grace said. Her voice shook slightly, and she hated that it did, but she pushed the words out anyway. "Please, try me. I will sweep your floors. I will bleed on your needles. I will do whatever this shop requires. I have a daughter at home, and I need this." Something shifted briefly in the older woman's face. Not softness exactly, but recognition. The particular look of a woman who has been desperate before and remembers precisely what it costs to say so out loud. "Margaret," the woman said, extending a flour-dusted hand. 10,000 naira a week. You start now, this minute. No time to go home and think about it. If you are not back in this shop in 15 minutes with your sleeves rolled up, I'll assume you changed your mind. Grace was back in 11. The work bruised her in ways she had never been bruised before. Her fingertips split and resplit against rough fabric edges until calluses finally formed. Her shoulders ached from hauling bolts of cloth nearly her own body weight. Her pride absorbed correction after correction from a woman half as educated as she was, but twice as skilled with her hands. And yet, within that pain, Grace found something she had not expected to find at all. A strange, hard-won peace. For the first hours of each day, her mind had no room left to spiral through grief or injustice. There was only the next stitch, the next fold, the next small task completed correctly. It was 3 weeks into this new life. Calluses formed, humiliations slowly dulling into something more like endurance, that Margaret said something that cracked the numbness open again. They were closing the shop for the night, Grace sweeping the last scraps of thread from the floor, when Margaret set down the account ledger she had been squinting at for the better part of an hour and simply sat, very still, on her wooden stool. "Come and look at this," she said quietly. Grace crossed to her side and studied the careful rows of figures. It took her only a moment, the eye her father had trained without ever admitting he was training it, to see what was wrong. Fabric ordered and paid for that had never once arrived on the shop's shelves. Money leaving the account in amounts that were too precise to be error, too consistent to be coincidence. "Who handles your supplier payments?" Grace asked gently. Her hands resting on the ledger went very still. "My nephew, Kevin, my sister's only boy. I raised him myself for 2 years after she passed. God rest her." Her voice cracked slightly on the last words, and for a moment Grace saw, beneath the sharp, capable woman who had hired her without hesitation, someone carrying her own private grief, one she had never once mentioned in 3 weeks of working side by side. "I am so sorry about your sister." Margaret waved a hand as if she could physically push the sympathy away before it undid her composure entirely. "It was a long time ago, but I raised that boy like my own son, Grace. I put him through school. I gave him a job here when no one else would hire a boy with his temper. And now..."
She gestured at the ledger, and her voice, when it came again, was thinner than Grace had ever heard it. Now I don't know if I even know him at all. Grace recognized that particular unmooring, the vertigo of discovering that the person you trusted with your whole heart had been quietly taking pieces of it for themselves the entire time. She had felt it in the parlor the day the will was read. She felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness now toward this woman who had given her a chance no one else would. "What will you do?" Grace asked. Margaret looked up at her, and something new had entered her expression. Not just grief now, but the beginning of resolve. "What would you do, Grace Okoro? You who lost your father's whole fortune to family greed and still show up here every morning with your sleeves rolled up instead of drowning in self-pity?" It was, Grace realized with a small jolt, the first time since her father's death that anyone had asked what she thought, rather than telling her what she ought to feel. "I would stop believing that blood guarantees loyalty," Grace said, slowly, feeling her way toward the truth of it as she spoke. "And I would go looking very carefully for the people who have actually earned my trust, even if none of them share my blood at all." Margaret held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, decisively, as though Grace had passed some final unspoken test. "Come in an hour earlier tomorrow. We have real business to discuss, not sweeping, business." Grace walked home that night through streets slick with the day's earlier rain, and for the first time since the funeral, she let herself feel something dangerously close to hope. Small, fragile, easily crushed, but undeniably there, glowing faintly in her chest like the last coal in a dying fire. She had no way of knowing that Kevin, humiliated at being caught and terrified of losing the aunt who was the only mother he had left, was already deciding, in the particular desperate logic of a cornered young man, exactly how far he was willing to go to make sure Grace regretted ever looking at that ledger. Margaret was already at the shop when Grace arrived the next morning, an hour early as instructed. 2 cups of tea steaming on the small table in the back room, where bolts of unused fabric were stacked to the ceiling. She looked as though she had not slept, the lines around her eyes deeper than usual, her hands wrapped tightly around her own cup, as if the warmth of it were the only thing holding her steady. "Sit," Margaret said, and Grace obeyed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the market was beginning its slow morning churn, the first hawkers calling out their wares, a bicycle bell somewhere, a child crying and being hushed. Inside, the silence between the two women felt heavier than any conversation could have been. "Margaret, let me finish." The older woman's voice was firm, though it trembled at the edges. "I want to make you my design partner. Not staff, partner. 20% of everything this shop earns going forward in exchange for your eye and whatever remains of the Okoro name that still means quality to people in this market." Grace nearly dropped her cup. "I have nothing to invest, Margaret. No capital. You know this. I don't need your money." Margaret reached across the small table and took Grace's hand, flour-dusted fingers closing over calloused ones. Two women who had each lost something essential, finding in that grip something like solid ground. "Margaret, I need to know that what I've built doesn't end the way it nearly did last night, in the hands of someone who took because they thought they were owed, instead of someone who will build because she remembers what it costs to have nothing. Say yes, Grace. Let an old woman feel before she dies that she left something behind that mattered." Grace felt tears rise, sudden and unbidden, and did not fight them this time. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking on the single word. "Yes, of course, yes."
For 2 months afterward, it seemed as though the universe had finally, grudgingly, decided to be kind. Under Grace's design guidance, patterns she had sketched in secret notebooks for years, techniques she had absorbed simply by watching her father's tailors when he wasn't looking, certain she would never be allowed to use any of it, Adaeze fashions began to draw a different class of customer. Women who wanted quality with a modern edge, who remembered the Okoro name, not for its recent scandal, but for the reputation of craftsmanship it once carried. Word moved through the market the way water moves through cracked earth, finding every available channel.
Mommy, why are you crying? Is it a sad thing again?
No, baby. This is a happy cry. Sometimes happy tears look exactly like sad ones.
Grace bought Faith a real bed. Not a mattress on the floor, but an actual bed frame. Second-hand, but sturdy. And she cried quietly in the shop's back room the day it was delivered, overwhelmed by a victory so small it would have meant nothing to her a year before, and now meant everything. "Mommy, why are you crying? Is it a sad thing again?" Faith asked, climbing onto the new bed to test it with the seriousness of a building inspector. "No, baby." Grace wiped her face and managed a real, unguarded smile. "This is a happy cry. Sometimes those look the same from the outside." It was a Tuesday. Grace would remember for the rest of her life that it was a Tuesday, the most unremarkable day of the week, chosen apparently for cruelty for exactly that reason, when Kevin struck back. She arrived at the shop to find 2 uniformed police officers waiting near the entrance and Kevin standing beside them with his arms crossed and a look on his face that Grace recognized immediately because she had worn it herself once in a different room over a different kind of theft. The particular brittle triumph of someone who believes they have finally won. "That's her," Kevin said, pointing. "She's been stealing fabric from the shop and reselling it under her own name. I have the receipts to prove it." "What proof?" Grace's voice came out steadier than she felt, though her heart had begun to slam against her ribs. One of the officers held up a small stack of papers, receipts bearing her name, dates she recognized, fabric quantities that matched nothing she had ever actually purchased. "These are forged," Grace said, taking one with shaking hands, studying the signature at the bottom. It looked close to her own, close enough to fool a casual glance, but the loop of the G curled the wrong way, a detail so small only someone who had signed their own name 10,000 times would catch. "Look, this is not my handwriting. I did not sign this." "You can explain that at the station, madam," the officer said, not unkindly, but with the flat finality of a man who had heard 1,000 denials and stopped being moved by any of them. Margaret arrived at a half-run, apron still on, just as the officer reached for Grace's arm. "Wait! This is my shop, my inventory, and I am telling you, this woman has stolen nothing from me. With respect, madam, we have a formal complaint and physical evidence. We cannot simply set that aside because you vouch for her character." Kevin's smile in that moment was the last thing Grace saw clearly before the officer's hand closed around her arm and the world seemed to tilt sideways. It was Margaret who came for her in the grey hour before dawn, having spent the money she could not afford to spend on bail, her face haggard with worry and fury in equal measure. "Faith?" Grace asked immediately, her voice raw. "Sleeping soundly in my own house on my own good pillow with a full stomach and no idea anything at all was wrong," Margaret said. "I told her you had gone to help me with an emergency delivery. She believed me completely. Children believe whatever love tells them to believe." Grace's legs nearly gave out with relief, and Margaret caught her by the elbow, holding her upright in the police station's dim corridor, the way one might hold up someone recovering from a fever. "I know it was Kevin," Margaret said grimly as they walked out into the cool pre-dawn air together. "He forged those receipts because he knew I was about to cut him out of the business entirely once I made you my partner in full. He chose to destroy you before you could take away what he'd already stolen." "The police believed him over both of us," Grace said. "And despite everything, despite the relief of Faith's safety, despair crept back in, heavy and suffocating. What hope do people like us have, Margaret? People without the right name behind us?" Margaret stopped walking and turned to face her fully, taking both of Grace's hands in her own. "We fight," she said, "with something stronger than his lies. We fight with proof. I did not raise you these past months to watch you fold now, Grace Okoro. Your father may have failed you. I will not." That single sentence, "I will not," settled into Grace's chest that morning and stayed there for a long time afterward, a small fierce ember she would return to on every hard night that followed. She did not sleep again that day either. Instead, sitting on the floor beside Faith's new bed while her daughter napped peacefully, unaware of everything her mother had survived in the last 24 hours, Grace pulled out an old notebook, one of the few possessions she had carried out of her father's house, and began methodically, painstakingly, to write down every discrepancy she could remember from Margaret's ledgers, every detail of the forged signature's telltale flaw, every date and figure that might help prove what she already knew to be true. If the world wanted proof before it would believe an innocent woman over a guilty man's confidence, then Grace would give it more proof than it could possibly find a way to ignore. She could not have known, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall in peaceful sleep, that the handwriting on those forged receipts would soon lead her to a print shop 3 streets from the market, and from there, impossibly, back towards the family she had sworn at her father's graveside never to speak to again.